A popular vlogger on gender issues, freedom of speech, and feminist interventions in the legal system, Diana Davison is known for her well-researched videos addressing the growing challenges facing men in the courtroom. Encouraging members of the public to take an interest in the legal system and to add their own voices to the discussion, Diana has become a strong voice in a community concerned with protecting and preserving civil rights. The question she's here to consider today is, do men need feminism? Well, many of you here are well aware that her YouTube channel is called Feminism LOL, and you might think that the answer she will give is fairly obvious. After all, she has uploaded videos with titles such as Feminists Bullied by Logic, Why Feminism is Fraud, The Women's Irrational Movement, and my personal favorite, Feminists Annoyed by Reality. Of course, this presentation is not going to start and end with the word no. Gender issues have become a pervasive subject that is much more nuanced. So without further ado, let's welcome Diana Davison and let's have fun exploring these issues together.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. It's pretty cold and rainy out there, so I appreciate it, and I'm really pleased to be doing a presentation for a cafe. Like Phil mentioned, I'm helping out with the legal clinic, and it's just starting, but we have big plans for it, and so if you or somebody you know needs help with any sort of a legal issue, I encourage you to look at it and come out. But today, we're going to look at an interesting question: do men need feminism? I could just say no, but I want to look a little bit deeper. So do they need? Here's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a more up-to-date one, as you can see. So on the chart of needs, I think if you look, you'll see that most men spend a lot of their time struggling with the lower level ones. And I would argue that a lot of women are raised to be more focused on the upper level ones. So I think that feminism has actually encouraged women to start looking and taking care of the lower ones, but unfortunately they haven't helped men to go from the lower level ones and focus on the upper ones. So that's something that they, often have to wait until they retire to try and achieve. And it's sometimes things that I think they don't even think about. So I'm going to ask, do men benefit from feminism? And to do that, I've looked at 3 different categories. There's many types of feminism, but I've come up with 3 different categories and how they function. And the first type, I'm calling it household feminism. This is something I've coined. But I called it that because I think this is something that you find most common. It's the largest group of feminists, and it's just sort of something around the household that we've come to agree upon. It's good for both genders and encourages people to break free from their gender roles. And it's not really full of rhetoric or ideologues, It's basically just the idea that men and women can do different things, not based on stereotypes. And of course, girls aren't always that innocent. I encourage them to take part, but we have to also remember that they're not these little angels that we build a lot of our other concepts about women around. So, activist feminism, they're the most notable and the most annoying. They tend to run with a good-evil paradigm, so they break things into, if you're, you're masculine, you tend to be related to things that are more aggressive, things that are bad for society and bad for people. And if you're feminine, you're the thing that the world needs more of, right? So, and we hear them most in social media, they're writing in magazines and so on. And then the legal feminists, and this is part of what I want to talk about today, is how the activist feminists and the legal feminists have started working together, and actually have been working together for a long time. And also how the household feminists, who aren't even aware they're part of this function, how they're the reasons why all of this stuff works, why all of the changes to the legal system, why all of these bizarre concepts like rape culture are actually accepted by people. They count on the larger body of the household feminists. But the legal feminists and activist feminists have been working together quite closely, and the legal feminists are the most insidious, in part because they're the ones you don't see, right? We feel the results of it, but you don't actually know who they are. And neither one of them, the activists or the legal feminists, care much about facts. And I'm hoping that the household feminists, start saying, hey, when, as they start hearing the information like Cafe is putting out there, they start hearing that the facts they're being told aren't actually real facts. They're not representative of the real world, that they are going to sit up and start, paying more attention. So, part of the legal feminists' design is that they think that women are perpetual victims, and the laws that they design have to cater to some sort of an inherent weakness in order to achieve equality. And I'm going to talk about all these a little bit more. What we see in colleges and university right now, this is activist feminists who have gotten together, and they've learned from legal feminists, but it's the activist feminists who are setting up these tribunals on campuses. And pretty much it's a trial ground, I think, for a different kind of court. Again, I'll get to that later. And they're ineffective, like I said, without the household feminists to back up all of these ideas. So, expanding on household feminism. It's fairly simple. They think that women can be intelligent, right? They're not necessarily always intelligent, but they can be. They may be interested in more male-type professions, that they might not want to have children and get married. So it opens up possibilities for women. And I'm calling it still feminism, as opposed to a lot of these people might consider themselves egalitarian, but I'm still calling it feminism because they still come at it with the attitude that girls need special help and special boosts, and that they're more vulnerable and need more protection. But the example is the general person on the street when they're polled and they say, would you call yourself a feminist? And they go, yeah, I would. But they don't really know what that means. And the general phrase is that women are people. It's rather uncontroversial. And one of the things I like about it is that it promotes individualism. And that's where I think that men can get some benefit. If women become more self-sufficient, then men aren't stuck in the provider protector role all the time. So that can actually be beneficial for men. And individualism is something that we're going to find is missing from the activist and the legal feminist stuff. But can this be sexualized in a weird way? Looks like a Halloween costume, one of the things that you'll hear a lot is that this type of image is something that it's the male gaze. But in reality, when you look, you'll see that it's women who try to figure out how to sexualize all these things. So they're the ones choosing their Halloween costumes, and they have a lot of fun with that. In part, household feminism, they have a view that sexuality shouldn't be shamed in either gender. And I think that's a really positive thing. They generally see sex as something that men and women participate in, and something they do together, which should also seem not really controversial. But it empowers women to not be ashamed of their sexuality, and it generally works towards an equality in the bedroom, I would say. The activists, though, they have this sort of an underground, if you look closely. This is Beyonce at the last Grammys Award. It was rather sickening, I thought. But it was so much bizarre with that. But there's a religious kind of attitude about women, which I call the divine feminine, that they promote this idea that the reason the world needs more women is because women have this sort of essence of woman, right? That there's some magical thing that they're going to bring to the world. And you don't see, I mean, sure, okay, fine, people want to dress up in some sort of a goddess outfit, go ahead, you're on stage. But you don't see men doing this. And I think that's kind of interesting. Well, Eddie Murphy, I think, did that once. But anyways. Right. Examples of activist feminists, other than performers, would be like Jessica Valenti, Laurie Penny. She's quite the fun one, actually. And their whole world is built on the idea, and they promote the idea that women are oppressed, right? And I've actually, challenged somebody in an oyster bar over that one. And if you say, women aren't oppressed, even just the simple idea that women aren't oppressed, outrage. The whole conversation fell apart and we all had to go home. Right? Seriously, over that one sentence. So their sayings are that women are oppressed and that women are victims, even from things like air conditioning. And that's pretty much how they spend their time, trying to figure out how women are victims of everything that occurs in the world. And it's built on hysteria and fear and mistrust. And their concepts are spread through rhetoric. This is really important. So these phrases like male violence, right? They practice this. They refuse to say the word violence without putting male in front of it because it's all violence against women. And you hear these phrases over and over and over again, and this is why the household feminists, the average person walking around, they think, well, of course, violence is male violence against women because I hear it all the time, right? That's kind of their job. This promotes a victimhood, though. So not only is it not good for men, it's not good for women. And they demand that men take special steps now because they're progressing. So it's not just good enough for women to, get out there and be bold and so on. But they want men to step aside and give their jobs to women. And they come up with things like he for she, because apparently women aren't strong enough without men doing their work for them. The idea of rape culture, you would think that everybody would realize that we don't live in a culture where we think rape is okay. That's why it's illegal, right? This has been going on for a long time. Even RAINN.org says that the concept is not helpful, that it makes us think that culture is responsible for rape when it's actually individuals who do it. No matter how much it gets talked about, it keeps going. I was just reading a sexual assault policy at UBC where they demand UBC recognize that rape culture is something that these girls at UBC need to be protected against. So they convince women that every negative sexual experience is rape, and that's really concerning. That's one of the forms of false accusation you get where you actually shouldn't even be blaming the person who's making the accusation, or the alligators. So I'm trying to get people to take up. Because they have a negative sexual experience, and then through embarrassment or whatever, they're relaying the story, and then they're told, well, what happened to you was rape. And they're like, really? And then gets into this great big dialogue. By the time they walk out the room, they're convinced what happened to them was rape, and so they report it as such. And I think that I prefer to think of sex in terms of positive and negative sexual experiences first. And a lot of things that are simply negative sexual experiences are being categorized as rape, and that's not something we want. We don't live in a world where we try to put as many people in jail as possible, especially for doing things that isn't really a crime. So anyways, they generally see sex as something that men do to women. Right? You'll see this, and this is why they want men to take all the responsibility for affirmative consent, and this is why the woman's subjective feeling, and this is in law now too, subjective feeling is actually the determining factor on whether or not there was consent. She doesn't have to express it, and everything is centered around only what's going on in her mind. Well, that's not really the way sex works. I wasn't sure what image we had up there at the moment. So they build their careers on this victimhood, and that's one of the dangers, is that they need to have more victims or they're out of a job. And so when you listen to these people, and that's generally the people that you're seeing in Huffington Post and so on, just keep that in mind, that they need victims. They're not actually trying to help women, and they're certainly not helping men. The legal, or lawyers, right, legal feminists, it's lawyers and law professors, and they litigate change for women. And they actually have acknowledged this as social engineering. Right? And so they go about intervening in court cases and changing the common law through one case at a time. And they're very well trained, very well organized. They needed to be able to cite professional works, so they created their own feminist legal journal. So they peer review each other's papers, and then they cite those in court cases. They're very, very clever. And their idea is that women are weak and they have to be treated differently. That women experience the world in a different way as a class, that they're actually, when you look at it, rather like children, and I've seen them compare the needs of women to the needs of children in terms of special courts required or special rules. And they also seem to think that women suffer from PTSD from minor sexual experiences. So it doesn't take much, just kissing and touching, that's sexual assault now. And not only is it sexual assault, but it can result in PTSD, which I think is an insult to war veterans. So examples of these, and you probably don't really know their names, except for I've talked about one a lot, is Elizabeth Sheehy from University of Ottawa, Constance Backhouse. She also works with Sheehy at the University of Ottawa. And Elaine Craig, who I'll be going to see speak when I'm in Toronto soon, she's at Dalhousie. And they participate a lot with a group called LEAF, that's the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. There's some interesting books on LEAF, and I can't remember what the one is my favorite one, but it actually lists all of the cases they've intervened in, why, and and whether they won or not. But the very first one, this is interesting, the very first one they intervened in, it was called R versus Andrews, it was Andrews, and he was arguing with the British Law Society about whether or not he could practice law in BC. And this became a precedent-setting case, one of the first ones, I think, if not the first one, using the Charter of Human Rights, Section 15, about equality. So it's kind of surprising when you think about it, and when I'm saying they're invisible, this is what I mean, is the first victory for Women's Education and Action Fund was to intervene in a case about a lawyer from England who wanted to practice law. And that change, they build these things one on the other until all of a sudden you find out that anything you do is rape. Right? So, but it is an interesting journey for those of you who have the mind to track it. And their phrase is, women are only equal if we make special laws for them. That's the phrase that I would give to them. Right? They think that women have emotional sexual frailty. Right? So they can't be expected to act rationally. Right? Anything they do before an experience, anything they do after an experience, these are all normal behaviors, drastically different. Right? It could be, on one end of the spectrum, I froze, I didn't say anything, and the other end is I'm screaming. Everything in between, they want to call a guy after he apparently raped them. That's all normal behavior. And the only way that every behavior can be normal is if women are irrational. So I think this is really insulting to women. And really frustrating for men, because if men have to figure out if they have consent, well, they have to have some sort of signal, be it verbal or body language, right? But no, apparently, according to them, all women are incapable of expressing themselves sufficiently. And the activists barrage the internet with all of the rhetoric that then the legal feminists take into the courtroom and make their arguments with. So they work very closely together, and in fact, LEAF didn't have much success until the activists whipped up the household feminist public, till they got a lot of people saying these phrases and expressing similar ideas about women and men. And then all of a sudden they started winning. Right? So their core social engineering technique is to use the Charter of Human Rights and Section 15. So as soon as Section 15 was ratified, then the LEAF organization came into being. Catherine McKinnon, God love her, came all the way up from the States to help them do that. And so it all focuses around equality, right? And what does equality mean? When you say, do you believe that men and women are equal, that also seems non-controversial, right? So yeah, I believe that women should have equal rights, that women should have equal access to things, that men and women should be, should try to live in a world that has a lot of balance to it. But there's a different kind of equality that LEAF says has been adopted by Canada, and that's called substantive. But first of all, I want to point out that Canadian judges play a role here too, because without activist judges, they wouldn't be able to get away with this, right? So there's, the judicial arm branches and the legislative branches are set up with checks and balances that are being overrun. In the past, we didn't think that the charter was going to be a problem because we had a similar bill in the past, or guidelines, and there was a lot of judicial restraint going on. But as soon as the charter came in, for some reason, the judges all became activists and they wanted to change the world one case at a time. And so they've been working together. And I want to point out that while men feel like a lot of feminism is targeting you as an individual, that they really are targeting the system. So in campuses, their targets aren't the individual men who get accused and run through this ridiculous kangaroo court system. They're targeting the institution of the university. They want institutional change. Same thing with men who are falsely accused and then railroaded through the system. It's not about persecuting that individual man, it's about changing society. It's this social engineering. So really, what men are feeling right now, although some are specifically, personally feeling the consequences, you're just a faceless person in a big long line of cogs in the wheels and on this effort to change the society, to change the machine, right? And only a woman's subjective feelings matter. So this is what we're hoping to try and do, is wake people up, take the masks off, and stop letting this happen. I'm going to talk about a case that's fairly recent, R versus Ur. Use that as an example because it covers a lot of these three areas, actually, but specifically types 2 and 3. But I mentioned equality and substantive equality, so I'm going to look at the question of equality first. Are we talking equality of outcome or equality of opportunity? Right, so equality of outcome is never guaranteed. Right? Strife provides a lot of personal growth. And people want different things in life, so not everybody gets happiness the same way. So this idea I find really odd that you can say, this is happiness, and so therefore we can do these things to help everybody acquire it. That's, again, not treating people like individuals. And we have equality of opportunity, right? A lot of that, the way I see it, is being in the right place at the right time. Well, how can you build a society to make sure that everybody is in the right place at the right time to have things happen well for themselves? Another problem is that people aren't equal, right? We are all different heights, we're different weights, intelligence, dexterity, personality types. This idea that people can all be the same. Well, I think teenagers all over the world from the beginning of time have rebelled against that. They want to stand out, they want to be different. Everybody wants to be different. So sameness isn't really something that we want to look towards. People often want things, but they don't want to do the work to get it. That's another problem we have to keep in mind when we're creating our societies and figuring out what equal means. And necessity is the mother of invention. So when people are without need, great things can happen. And the idea that everybody would get to some utopia where we're all sitting around and nobody has to work, so machines are doing it for us and everything, I just don't think that leads to happiness. And I think that we wouldn't be living in the incredibly amazing society with all our technology if we didn't have people who were struggling. It stifles individuals by assuming that they want sameness. But the next question about substantive equality and formal equality, right, which is the better model? So substantive equality, that's the thing that's being pushed right now, means that people should be treated differently in order to achieve equal results or achieve some form of equality. Where one person, the first case I heard about this being used is one person, when they went to court, looked like they could have not murdered somebody because they could have probably escaped given the situation. But they had to realize that at the time the incident happened, he was on crutches, so he actually couldn't run away. So he had to use more lethal force to defend himself. So that's a version of substantive equality that I think is quite rational. That there's classes of people that require special laws. This is the idea behind it. So this is where we start running into problems, and that's where Section 15 comes in. So Section 15 is the one that says that you have the right not to be discriminated on based on your sex, your race, your religion, all these other things. They keep adding more, sexual identity, sexual expression. So these people have become a special class of people. And it's kind of interesting when you look at what was called hate crimes. When we punish people more severely for hate crime, in a way, we're actually saying that death was worse than somebody else's death, right? It's kind of a bizarre thing that's happened in England, and they were pointing it out that 2 young men died on the tube system, I think it was, and one was just a regular guy, and the other guy happened to have been gay or black or something. And everybody was outraged over the guy in the class group who was oppressed, but it was almost the same circumstances. So I think that's something to keep in mind in terms of how we think of these classes of special people. And also, they're getting special laws designed for them. And with gender, one of the more controversial is that arguments have been made that women should be allowed to murder men. And Elizabeth Sheehy, who I mentioned earlier, has even made a case that they're doing a public service, right? Because men are violent towards women and the law system isn't dealing with them properly. So when a woman murders a man, then we have to not treat it like actual murder. I kid you not. This is in her book, Defending Battered Women. And so that's kind of what happens when you get into substantive, right? And I'm not even giving you a slippery slope. This is where we're at, right? So, and there's further to go. Formal equality, when we say men and women are equal, that's what people are thinking of. So we're thinking of meritocracies, right? Where you if you want something, you go out and you work for it. And so that we think people should be able to go out and work for things and do what they can. And we also think that everybody should follow the laws without exception. Now, there's a lot more laws than I think society needs right now, but there's core ones that we all agree on, right? Like some book about how many laws the average person breaks in a day, and you don't even necessarily even know it. But there's definitely ones that we all agree that we need to follow to have a civil society. And I think that all people should follow these laws. And to me, that's equality. One of the problems that we're looking at right now in the system, and I think doing fairly well at fixing with fathers' rights, is that parental value doesn't prefer one gender or the other. That would be equality to me, that both parents are considered valuable and equal and important in the child's life. We're getting a little bit closer to that, but it's been a really big fight and a lot of success there, in part in Canada because of Senator Ann Cruell's involvement, I think. But people should be treated as individuals, not before the law looked at as a member of a group, right? So if I find myself in court, I'm not there as a woman. I'm there as Diana Davison, who's done something or not done something. Let's find out, right? And I don't think it's that difficult to do, right? You can look at, like, men will have issues, like the gentleman I mentioned earlier, who was on crutches. Everybody might have issues that cause them to be in front of that court. And the way to determine the truth and to look at facts is to look at that individual. And but keeping in mind that it's never okay to kill someone. Self-defense, yes. But we can't compromise what we think is a crime and allow some people to get away with it. So I'm actually, one of the things I'm doing is fighting against this substantive equality. And I think that, I haven't done any polls, but I'm pretty sure that most people, that's the kind of equality that they're comfortable with, right? So sentencing in criminal cases, that's where I think substantive really comes into play, is that, if you've done a crime, you've done it, and then when it comes to sentencing, then you can take all these other factors into account. So these are interesting philosophical and in some cases political debates, and we could talk more about that in question, timeframes in terms of quality of outcome, and, so on. But I'm going to move on to, let's see, what is my next one? I had a lot of other little things in here, but I think I'm taking longer, so I'm going to skip ahead. So simple doesn't mean that it's not based on activist or legal feminist ideas. That's the household feminists, right? I said they have a simple kind of feminism. And that's really the difference here. And when we are faced with a bunch of people saying, how dare you say that feminism isn't doing any good, then I think that's generally what people do, is try to point out that it's not so simple. That they need to actually pay attention because it's their energy being used to pass laws that I don't think they agree with. So what is the problem? Is there a problem? We're having a discussion today because there is a serious problem. There's a number of them. There's a breakdown in relationships, fatherlessness, rising hostility between the genders, yes, all women, kill all men on Twitter, reduction to this type of dialogue. There's no dialogue going on. Men are being railroaded in the criminal and family courts. There's due process is being eroded. And even if you prove your innocence in the court of law, the activists will make sure that you'll continue to be seen as guilty in the court of public opinion, especially when you're looking at sexual assault charges. You can never be innocent as soon as you've been charged. More and more people are finding themselves in this situation, and if not themselves, a friend or a family member. And the reality is that it can and does happen to everyone. So these things that seem distant, that seem like it's somebody else's problem, well, you can wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden it's yours. And you want to start caring before it's you. I'm going to look at the current case of R versus Ororar. The appeal for that, he was convicted. This is Mustafa Ororar. He was convicted, and his appeal is happening on March 14th. I'm going to be in Toronto for that. And it's an interesting case because it went through the criminal courts. There was a university complaint that went to the Human Rights Tribunal. And there was an attempt at actually using the little kangaroo courts to get him as well. But it encompasses a lot of these different types of activism. And it has some really interesting aspects as well, in which the complainant used a lawyer to coach her. And this is really problematic. They're trying to get this more. They already got in Ontario 4 hours of legal advice or legal assistance that a complainant can get. And the result, and I've already seen this myself in the few times I've been in court already, that you end up with somebody on a witness stand who's supposed to be telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But when you ask them a question, you get rhetoric in response. And I think, in terms of deciding if somebody is being open and honest and if they're credible, then you have to recognize this rhetoric coming out of their mouths as being, a resistance towards actually just talking about the facts. And as soon as there's an agenda in there, it discredits them. And the rhetoric isn't just because all of a sudden it's only activists going into the court accusing people. They're surrounded by victims advocates who are helping them to recolor their experience in the strongest terms. And also now they're going to be getting legal advice so that they can lie better, as far as I'm concerned, in court. It's a very serious concern. The use of the lawyer actually has become a fairly big issue. And one of the things that the particular lawyer involved in the Aurora case wants to do, he's one of the most vocal people. He's not the only one, but he's the most vocal person in the news talking about a new type of court for sexual assault. The decision in Aurora by Justice Zucker is the most feminist decision ever written. So in terms of the changes to the law that feminists are pushing for, if you want to see what it's going to look like, go read Justice Zucker's decision. It's about 190 pages or something like that, and the first 2/3 of it pretty much are copy pasta from the transcripts. You almost don't need to read the transcripts. And you don't even know why he's putting those sections in there. There's no reference as to why he's including this in the decision. And when he does finally get to his reasoning, then what you end up with is a bunch of sentences that go, no, didn't happen. This is a judge speaking, right? It was a rant. And I'm going to get to some very specific things that were wrong in that decision. Mandy Gray, that's the complainant in this case. She chose not to use publication ban. Just a quick summary of how this went down. They were seeing each other casually. Mustafa was in an open relationship. He decided that he wasn't really that into Mandy, and she asked him out for hot sex one night, but by the end of the night, he was kind of like, yeah, I think we should break up. But they had consolation sex. And the next morning, she decided that that was rape. And she wanted him removed from campus almost instantly. And she, in fact, contacted the CBC and had an interview within a month, and went down really, really, really fast. And that interview was solely to say, I'm not going back to campus because campus hasn't, satisfied me in terms of their response. And all right, so David Butt was coaching her on. It's interesting because they submitted a lawyer's bill for David Butt in her expenses as part of her cost of having been, victimized. And he also participated in a film. She made a documentary, and this is a big part of why Mandy didn't want her name banned. She's created a group called Silence is Violence. They're installing them on all these campuses, and she's linked to Glenys Kirchmeier, who is demanding that UBC, she's actually taking UBC to the Human Rights Tribunal, even though she herself was never sexually assaulted on campus. She says just being female on that campus with that sexual assault policy they had made her unsafe. So that would be terrifying if she was to win. That means any woman who's walking around UBC, now for the last few years, would all of a sudden demand a lot of money from UBC if she was to win this. And she's connected with Mandy Gray, and she Silence is Violence. And so this activism included a documentary called Slut or Nut. And they're in the final phases of putting this thing together. And David Butt is in this. And also he appeared they had sample shots of him advising her on what it was going to be like to be on the stand. So they've submitted a bill to the court for David Butt's services. And there was no breakdown. I want to know, is he being asked to pay David Butt's acting fees for this documentary as well? And you got to watch these people really closely. There were other shenanigans going on where they had, as Grace said herself, oh, I didn't do that. But a bunch of people were saying, pack the court. They got tons of people to go pack that courtroom during the rape trial, to the point where there was snickering going on. And I believe Mandy was actually sort of giggling herself on stand, which I do think, no matter what these advocates say, that when a person is testifying and they're laughing, then that should be taken into account on credibility. All right, so 5 specific areas from this that I want to point out that are bias against men. They had stereotypes about male versus female sexual aggression and rape as a gendered problem. There's lots of research and there's new studies coming out showing that females are perpetrators about half the time. And until we start looking at complete statistics and understanding the complete problem, we're not going to solve anything. We're just going to keep throwing innocent men in jail, along with the ones who are guilty, but we're not going to be solving anything. Right. These stereotypes were really prevalent in the decision. If you want to skip through the first 2/3 of it and go check it out, Zucker's decision is actually quite important for people to read. There's a burden of establishing consent it's biased against men and not aligned with scientific findings. Right now, this just isn't, it's not just this case, but the idea that men alone are responsible for acquiring consent and ongoing consent even, that they're solely the gender responsible, even when, especially when you get alcohol involved in the mix. What studies show is that, and what we can see quite evidently is that women are the better communicators. We use more words, we're more expressive, we're actually better at communicating than men. So I want to know, why is it that men are solely responsible for establishing consent even when the woman's not using words and body language, apparently. The third is that affirmative consent model doesn't match human behavior. Even feminists have acknowledged this. They said one of the troubles we have getting affirmative consent on campus is that that's not the way people actually experience sexuality with each other. Even the feminists know this. So how is it that they expect men to go against human nature? Men as a gender solely, just men. Right? So women can keep doing whatever they want because they're vulnerable and they're irrational and they can't control themselves. But men, they have to learn how to alter humanity and actually experience sexuality on a verbal level. So I think if that's something that we decide we want, if affirmative consent was a model that's going to make everybody happier, then until we can change human nature, then both genders should be responsible for it. The idea that just men are culpable in any sexual situation for communication or for altering human behavior is insane. Collective punishment and collective guilt. So there was a fair bit in here where Judge Zucker goes on a rant about how women have been historically victimized and treated so poorly, and they were seen as chattel, he even says. And so then you have to ask yourself, what does that have to do with Mustafa Urrar? Why are we talking about this in his verdict? And that's because Mustafa was being held responsible for the collective guilt of men, the collective guilt that was in the judge's mind. And you can see this collective punishment and collective guilt all over the place in terms of how we decide who gets shelters, how we decide how much, I can't remember how many millions of dollars were just pledged to women's issues by Trudeau recently. But all of that money is always filtered towards women only because men, well, you know what? They just don't deserve it because they've always had power. They've always had everything. Men as a group, because you're not individuals. You're just members of a group. That it's time that they suffer so that women can get ahead. Well, there's never a good time to make somebody suffer, especially when they didn't do anything wrong. And in this case, it's very clear that Mustafa Urrar is being punished simply for being male. To back that up, there is a quote, "We then argue that in some societies, men are collectively responsible for rape, since most benefit from rape, and most are similar to the rapist." That's an actual quote. It came from a man, actually, and was written in Men in Group's Collective Responsibility for Rape, published in 1994. So there's two authors on that, and both of them are men. So I kid you not about this collective guilt. Male promiscuity, in this case, was being used as an indicator that he was more likely to rape. There's a couple of aspects to this, actually, that Mustafa was in an open relationship. The judge couldn't wrap his mind around the idea that any woman would agree to sleep with somebody who had another girlfriend. And he mentions this a number of times. And then he also references how many girlfriends Mustafa had at that school prior to Mandy Gray. So this idea that because she was girlfriend number 4, or was it number 5, it was written so poorly, I think that's actually a quote from in there. that he decided that, oh, this guy he's a cretin, if not a criminal, so let's throw him in jail because all of these poor women who are obviously being forced to sleep with somebody who's got another girlfriend, or just the promiscuity idea made him think that he was more likely to rape, and potentially other people as well. It's certainly something that goes along with the whole idea of male aggression. A quote on this one: Bateman's conclusions and predictions have become axiomatic and at times have gone unquestioned, even when modern empirical data do not conform to his model. Now, Bateman, this idea about promiscuous men and women comes from Bateman's principles, right? And let me go back and see where, so I jumped ahead. So the stereotype is that, men are by nature more promiscuous than women are, right? So it comes from Bateman's principles. And that has been debunked, but we're not updating our understanding of sexuality and of male and female differences as these studies come out. So one of the things LEAF would do would be to choose a case to intervene in to try and bring this stuff to attention. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping to help men's rights do, is get to a point where we're able to intervene and update all of the information that these decisions are based on and laws are based on. So a summary of the issues to consider here. Mostly what I'm talking about are rape shield laws. So rape shield laws as a whole, they function to make it so that you can't cross-examine, you can't fully defend yourself. A lot of the evidence that you have to bring, and it's so hard to find evidence in these cases where generally it's happening in a box, right? There's not many witnesses there. So evidence of text messages before Mustafa Aurora had come out for hot sex, apparently that's irrelevant because it happened too far before. Even worse, there was a case which you may have heard of from Judge Robin Camp being ejected from the bench, where they had a witness who left these two alone in the washroom, in this case called R versus Wagar. They were left alone in the bathroom because a girl there said, "Are you going to have sex with this guy?" And she said, "Yes." And apparently that wasn't relevant, and the prosecutor argued the moment the door closed, nobody knew what happened, right? So this is insane. These rape shield laws are preventing people from introducing the very little evidence that you can gather, right? No matter how good it is, unless it was a video camera in the room, and apparently it doesn't mean anything. That the stereotypes about men and women coming into the courtroom, it's almost a form of character assassination. It was really interesting that Mustafa Auror's sexual history was allowed to be introduced into court because if you try to bring in anything with a woman's sexual history, absolutely banned, right? And this information in the court was essentially used to character assassinate him. And the weird thing is that if you had prior convictions, right, not just prior girlfriends, if you actually had prior convictions, they wouldn't have been likely allowed to bring that into the courtroom. So beyond looking at these things and understanding how important it is when an accused person with the power of the state against them and their sometimes really meager resources, whatever they bring in the courtroom, it must be allowed, right? Even with juries. Judges should know how to weight the evidence. Even with juries, let them decide what they think is important and what isn't. There's a reason why we brought a jury system in the first place, right? But we have to ask ourselves, if a guy is innocent, then do we have any way left for them to prove it? Right? And it's getting to the point where you can't. Another problem, and it seems absurd, is that a lot of women don't understand the seriousness of making, especially in sexual assault, don't understand the seriousness of making an allegation. And it seems absurd, but I tell you it's true. I think to some degree in women's world, there's so much gossip, there's so much slander, backstabbing, and then they move on to the next person and then they forget, right? And then that person comes back in the group and they might even participate in slandering somebody else. And so this transient quality in high school, especially with the world of women, they don't understand the consequences. There was one false accuser who was caught and the police realized that they had evidence that she'd lied. And they said, well, if we charge him with this, he could go to jail for 25 years. Do you think that's fair? And she said, I think it's a little harsh. I think maybe 2 would be okay. Right? And no idea what it means to be in jail. And if you try to point this out to them, then you're silencing the victims. Right? And one of the arguments that lawyer David Butt made for this idea of a hybrid court, he said that sometimes these women, they just can't move on. They just can't go forward. And so this is a way to give them closure. And I questioned him whether or not the court should be a form of therapy. Right? It's there's therapists for that. That's not what the courtrooms are for, especially in these cases where you have women who aren't paying a dime to get their therapy, and then you've got men. I believe Mustafa Orar's bill's at around $60,000 right now, and therapy, it belongs somewhere else. I also argued with David Butt about his ideas of substantive equality, and all of his arguments for this hybrid court are based on the idea that everybody just simply accepts substantive equality. That's wrong. He needs to be questioned, and he needs to be looked at more closely. He's going to be appearing at this appeal to argue why he should get paid. And as restitution in a criminal trial, people get costs when they go to civil court. When a man has spent $60,000 trying to keep himself, an innocent man, out of jail, and he's being asked to pay lawyer fees for somebody who's been coaching somebody and acting in their documentary. I think this is a lawyer that really needs to be looked at more closely. And hopefully I'll be seeing him on the 14th. All right, so this new system, I think it's really important. A lot of people are being affected by these kangaroo tribunals in the universities. There's a lot of noise being made about that. Families of men who've lost their education and their careers without any form of due process. I've been actually at one of these, part of one of these hearings. And so they're raising a bit more noise about it. And we need to look closely at it, not just to save these young men, but because I believe that this is a model that they're going to try and install as a criminal model as well. So we have to learn about that. The hybrid courts as a form of therapy. Right? Well, she seems like she's having a good time. Courts are never fun. I help people who are trying to put together evidence to prove their innocence in court. And a lot of people think that there should be civil cases for some form of restitution once they get through and prove that they're innocent. And my advice is that courts are never a good place to be. Anytime you go, even in a civil case, you're like looking at 2 years, and your whole life will be stuck at that point for 2 years. It's a terrible place to be. And the idea that they're encouraging women to work out some of their emotional issues, and I think personality issues, by hauling people in front of a court system is basically saying, oh yeah, this is a great future for everybody. This is from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, by the way. So do men need feminism? Let's go back to the start. Well, here's some of the utopian visions. Right? Wouldn't that be great? Yoga pants. Everyone looks great when they're wearing yoga pants. Right? So we're going to design a utopia. These realistic, right? This is what we're being asked to believe. We'll just take away due process. We'll just take away all your ability to defend yourself in court, and we'll have this. A lovely utopia. What really helps is honest communication between men and women, especially with sexual assault trials. What I was saying earlier, negative sexual experiences, they happen to both genders. We've got Coyote Ugly. It's a well-known story about the guy who wakes up next to somebody so ugly, she's on his arm, he'll chew it off to get out of there. Right? Mm-hmm. Women are not the only ones who wake up the next morning with regret. So I think that, feminists say that they want to talk about rape. I think we need to talk about negative sexual experiences. We need to actually allow men to talk about the embarrassing things that happen to them. And we need to understand that sometimes sex doesn't go right. Sometimes accidents happen while you're there. Things don't turn out well. People have a lot of fun and they can get themselves into some really serious situations as well. And it's not all bad intent. And also, both genders, you can go to bed with somebody thinking they're fabulous, but by the time you finish listening to them all night, and by the time you have sex, which wasn't so great as you thought so, right? You can both in the morning be like, oh, yeah, so I'll call you. Right? And it's okay, and it's funny. We can actually have these conversations without being angry. Let's talk about it, and let's understand that women's experience of sex is not the only experience that matters, right? If we're going to have better relations with each other, then we need to know what it's like from the other side. I know what it's like on my side. I'm more intrigued to find out what it's like for the other people. I really wish we could have a more open discussion about this. And, there's lots of ways we can do that. The embarrassment, regret, bad feelings of many kinds. The important thing is that we label our experiences properly and that we don't pathologize or criminalize things that aren't actually crimes. What we need is balance. So while men can benefit from feminism, if women want to be more self-sufficient, right, that's actually their goal. They want women to get out and get careers that aren't just hobbies. They want them to have fulfilling lives and to be stronger and more self-sufficient. Then that's going to work out well for them, and it's going to work out well for men because it frees frees men up to think about their Maslow's hierarchy all the way to the top as well. They're not always constantly going to have to feel like the only ones responsible for making sure there's food on the table. But feminism won't work for men or for women as long as there's a devaluation and dismissal of one gender, right? That one gender is expected to sacrifice for the supposedly weaker gender. That men have to, give up, give over, and be the he for she, be everything in order to. This is such the he for she thing, given what feminists say about men. It's just so bizarre that you apparently you've built up these wonderful women, and yet men have to prop them up in some way still. I think if feminists really think that that's something that women are capable of, then they need to get a little bit smarter about it, and they have to start having honest conversations. You can't have one gender who's always the sacrificer and one gender who's always the beneficiary. Men and women are individuals, right? I'm not a feminist. I'm an individualist. And I think that that's the thing that helps people in life. That's the thing that empowers them. I think that's the thing that makes them feel like their life has meaning and value, and that even though we're also compelled by these classifications. You go online and it's just like, which character from The Simpsons are you, right? We have horoscopes. We have all these things that people are desperate to classify themselves. There's enneagrams for those people who are interested in bizarre spiritual things. And we're obsessed, especially when we're younger, with trying to figure out how to classify ourselves all the time. But really what we want is we want to be unique. We want to be individuals and we want to be seen that way. And I think that men and women can start approaching each other in a more balanced way when they start approaching each other as individuals. Don't expect things because of the person's gender. Don't expect things because of their race or their religion. All these things, it's all meaningful to consider, but not meaningful when you're taking people and making them just a member of a class. That's the way I deal with people. Every single person I meet, I have no expectations. I want to know who they are. And then you develop a relationship from there. So we balance our lives around our weaknesses and strengths. There's some things that I'm not going to be very good at. I did do construction for a bit, but I had to do it differently. Right? There's nothing wrong with being weaker, of having different strengths and different weaknesses. That's part of our challenge. It used to be the thing where people would try to learn how to love themselves, right? Instead of trying to figure out how to change everything about themselves. But even worse than that, right now we're not even trying to change ourselves. Feminists are saying, you change yourself so that I'm okay, right? And it's a bit of an impossible challenge that I'd like to leave you with the thought that, before questions, no gender has a monopoly on victimhood, right? And the only way forward is to drop the victimhood. And that is something I've seen in men's rights, something that I'm not too keen on building up. It's important to recognize when you're hurt, but building up a victimhood narrative, to fight a victimhood narrative, I don't think is going to result in any form of balance whatsoever. I do. I've still got lots of time.